All right, guys, we have Sterling Lee right now. He is the Regional Councillor of Ward 2. Sterling, how you doing, my friend?
I am doing well, Ken. A little tired, but I will power
Power
through
through it.
this.
That's
I just got timing wise, we just finished the election probably a week and a half ago. And during that last week of the election, I was terribly sick. I think I got the flu for my kid. So pretty much for the week after the election, I had like no voice because I had coughed my voice out. So if I don't sound 100%, you'll hopefully forgive that.
and you still won. That's the thing.
Yes. That's
That's
the
the thing.
important thing, right? That's
This is why I try to tell the listeners. It's very interesting because before, like, a little bit of the history that this podcast was started because of the pandemic and hearing all the stories of small businesses that were kind of closing. And I thought, oh, it would be nice to hear from these small business owners and mainly geared towards Canada. So that's what we were doing. And then next thing we know, we're starting to build up some steam that I was starting to get guests from the United States coming. We had the mayor of Scranton, Pennsylvania. And we're diving into a little bit of the political space, but we're not going to be comparing like policies or anything like that in all political shows. But Sterling, like I said, he is now a municipal councillor here in Ajax. We even had Arthur Augustine, who was a mayoral candidate with Ajax. And I think we're trying to get, Nancy Henry, who's just a regular Ward 2 councillor. I think she wants to do the show as well. So, even though it may be some political items, we're still always going to bring it back to how does this affect the small business owner and how to inspire them to continue to try to do their own thing. So glad to have Sterling on here. So Sterling, just a little bit of background to the listeners. Define what is a regional councillor. Because I know in the Ontario, or maybe in Ontario, we have like regular councillors, we have regional councillors, and then of course we have like trustees, and then of course we have the mayor. So explain to some of the listeners who may not be familiar, what are the goals, the roles differ from the regional councillor to the ward councillor?
Sure thing. So, in Canada, this is for your US listeners. We have three levels of government. We have the federal level, which is the prime minister. We have the provincial level, which is the highest, the premier. Then we have a municipal level. And there are certain municipalities in Ontario that are considered two-tier, which means there is a regional tier and then the local tier. The local tier, the highest level is the mayor. And so I sit on the local council. But then in the next level would be the regional tier in Pickering, Ajax, Whitby, Oshawa, Clarington, Brock, Scugog, and Uxbridge. They make up the region of Durham, and that in itself has its own upper tier government. And what that does is, long story short, there's a lot of services that can be amalgamated and pooled, like police services and planning and water and sewage. So the regional councillors deal with those specific issues as it deals with the region as a whole. But then I also sit on the local council, which means I deal with just specifically Ajax Council issues.
Okay, perfect. So that's interesting to hear. It's good to know as well, because I remember when I would see literature from wards and regionals, I'm like, so what is the difference? Because we're having Ward 2.
Who does what? Who does what?
Do you see that as sometimes, did you have to do that educational process even with local residents when you are knocking doors and saying, oh, I'm ready for regional council?
Constantly. People would often confuse me, being like, oh, I was going to vote for so-and-so local councillor. I can't vote for you now. And I'd have to explain the regional council. And then inevitably they'd always be like, well, what's the difference? So, it's a failure of our education system, if nothing else. I think our schools have to do a better job teaching it. But quite honestly, I'm sure I went through this in grade 5 civics, and it wasn't until I was an adult before I truly understood the difference. So we need better branding is what we need.
Yeah. Well, I think they don't do that much in schools anyways, right? So no one really talks about politics unless you're like college, university, where you might say, oh, I'll study politics or political science or anything like that. But especially for my kids as well, I'm trying to teach them just a little bit. Obviously, I'm not as good as you on it, and how important it is to vote for every single election. Same with my wife, Mrs. K, where, she just says, who are you voting for? I said, well, I'm voting for this, but I don't want you to follow me. I give her all the literature from all the candidates. Here's who's running. Here's what they're saying. You make your decisions, even from the federal and provincial levels. And for the U.S. listeners, provincials is kind of like governor, pretty much, where they're running the states.
Right. That's right.
I'll say, I don't really care which party you vote for, right? I could be leaning one way. You can vote for wherever you want, because not a lot of countries have that kind of freedom nowadays. Like, we don't have the freedom of choice sometimes.
Well, you mentioned, the pandemic, and the biggest example I always use is Hong Kong. So Hong Kong used to be under British rule in 97. Now it's now under Chinese rule. And China always said it's going to be like kind of two different governments. We'll give you the local democracy, but then the overhead Chinese government rule. And then over time, the Chinese government kept cutting into the, Hong Kong government democracy. And I remember specifically during the pandemic, it was like 7 million Hong Kong residents in the streets of Hong Kong. And Hong Kong is not a very large country in of itself, right? It's actually quite small. So just like the comparison is 3-4 times the population of Toronto marching in the streets for democracy, for their right to vote. And it's something I think in a lot of Western nations we take for granted because we're just like, oh, it's whatever. But it's like, you don't realize you have something till it's gone. And those people in Hong Kong, they realized they had lost it and they wanted to fight for it. So I always use that example of just like, yeah, every vote counts. And more to the point of every vote counts, in the Ajax election, one of the races was won by 33 votes.
Yeah.
Like, I can't even explain how close 33 votes is 5 houses going from one candidate to the other.
Yeah.
If I knocked on 5 more doors and convinced five more residences to vote for me, I could possibly have won that election. Like that.